Hello, I'm Ian Spreadbury, and this is my take on what might be going on with Western disease and obesity. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. As the time when you'll be watching this, I'll just be starting at medical school in Montreal, so it's kind of a good reason me not being here. My take on the what's going on with obesity sort of stands on a number of pillars of evidence, which I'm hoping to take you through over the next 25 minutes and leave you understanding where I'm coming from and why I see things the way I do. Uh, Western diseases are a newish phenomenon in that their incidence was very low or virtually absent before the agricultural and industrial revolutions, and that the thing that's changed that seems to be bringing them about is likely to be diet, it's food. And the literature detailing this state of the field is brilliantly summarized in the excellent text by Staffan Lindberg, Food and Western Disease, which, if you haven't currently read or got a copy, I strongly suggest you get on it. It's well worth it. The second pillar of evidence is that obesity seems to be a defect of energy homeostasis. It's not something that's accidentally happened because we've accidentally overeaten too much or not done enough exercise. The brain is actually closely monitoring the levels of fat tissue that we've got on the body, and it's monitoring it using a hormone known as leptin. In the obese, what's happening is that, greatly simplified, is that the signal from leptin doesn't seem to be getting through to the brain, which then responds behaviorally and metabolically as though we don't have sufficient food as if we're starving. And this causes the responses of increased food intake and decreased energy expenditure, which in turn increase the levels of fat tissue, and which in turn produce more leptin, which finally gets through the reduced signaling ability. And the obese person will then homeostatically defend this new heavier weight. It's kind of analogous to putting a damp towel around a thermostat in a cold apartment, with the thermostat set too low, to try and stop the thermostat seeing how hot the room really is so that the heater will keep on running. And so similar analogous things going on in obesity. The third bit of evidence is that the vagus nerve seems to be playing an early and crucial role in leptin resistance and causing this overweight. Obesogenic diets are causing gut inflammatory changes in the upper gut very early in proceedings, which are causing an inflammatory reduced leptin response to the vagal fibers, which in turn then affects and causes a reduced satiety signaling and increased food intake. It's interesting that none of these changes are seen in germ-free mice, which leads us on to pillar number 4, which is that the gut microbiota seem to be playing a crucial role in obesity and metabolic dysfunction. Germ-free mice are resistant to most models of diet-induced obesity. The microbiota is known to be changed in obese animals and humans, and crucially, that overweight phenotype seems to be transferable by stool transplant, which is important because that implies that the microbiota are playing a potentially causal role in things. And similarly, recent research that's come out over the last couple of years, and this is being found by lots of groups. This is a particular study that I'm highlighting because it's got quite a nice catch to it, and that's these obese animals, when they're fed a Western-type diet, they get elevated levels of T helper 17 cells and increased interleukin 17, which are all sort of pro-inflammatory. If you co-feed these mice with a certain type of probiotic that this lab is working on, the T regulatory cell level comes back up, and you start getting an increase in the anti-inflammatory side of things, including the cytokine interleukin 10. The probiotic wasn't significantly altering the rest of the microbiota. It more sort of reached in and performed a direct immunotherapeutic tweak on the immune system. What was very exciting about this study was that they were able to transfer this protective effect of these probiotics to the overweight mice simply by moving over the T regulatory cells. So again, implying that something about this immune system balance is potentially playing a causal role in this chain of events. It's the fifth pillar is it's been known for some time that carbohydrates appear to be playing part of the problem for the obese because It's been known for a long time that low-carb diets seem to work better than other diets, at least not without causing hunger, in a way that's consistent with something about consuming carbohydrate. It's widely suggested that insulin was playing a role in this somehow, was able to inhibit the energy homeostasis or proper function, and this was leading to increased food intake and decreased energy expenditure. Of course, the fly in that particular ointment is that ancestral diet benefits seem to be macronutrient independent. You have a gradient of carbohydrate consumption between the equator and the poles, but there's no equivalent gradient apparently in metabolic health or overweight when you look at the populations. And one of the best characterized populations that eats a very high level of carbohydrate in the forms of root veg fruit, the Catawbans, they're eating about 70% of their energy intake in the form of carbohydrate. They've been exceptionally well studied, and you can see there's population-wide excellent metabolic health if glycemic response, insulinemic response per se was part of the problem. You would expect at least a subset of that population to be sick. So what if it's the microbiota of the upper gut that could cause some of these early inflammatory changes, that we're actually able to detect the difference between the old and the new carbohydrates? And that's not such a tall story, really, because, as was pointed out by Peter Cleve back in 1974 in his book, The Saccharine Disease, raw foods are resistant to bacterial decomposition, in as much as the cells constituting such foods are, or recently were, alive. And he was very smart and didn't want to get drawn on exactly what that resistance was, but he said that what matters is that that's not present in inert foods like refined sugar. And when you start to think about food in this way, it opens up a whole new way of looking at things, not just chemicals and macronutrient composition, but a complex ecosystem interaction between life, the food, meeting life, your microbiota, all going on within life, us, and each of them able to affect the other. So the ancestral foods, the old type cellular foods, were cellular or alive. They had low carbohydrate density, probably as a spin-off of being cellular. You have to have enough runny stuff in the cells to move the soluble parts around to be alive. They have evolved complexity, both structural and molecular, and at least part of that structure and molecular adaptation is with a view to stopping animal and plant cells being made easy food of by whatever bacteria they encounter. And this causes a slightly delayed release also, that you're going to get those cells going to be cracked open, whatever starches are inside and sugars are going to be released more in the small intestine than in the mouth, which again, over on the modern food side, these are acellular dead chemicals. They've got no they've not been put together with any consideration at all to their effects on bacteria. They've got a high carbohydrate density because they don't have cells. You can condense them down that much more. They behave much more like a simple bacterial nutrient broth when they're dissolved, and they're immediately released from the mouth onwards. You get amylases working away on starches from the mouth, and of course things like Twinkies and stuff with lots of sugar, that's going to be immediately released from the mouth onwards. So it seems reasonable to suggest that in this environment of freely available food that doesn't fight back, it doesn't play evolutionary chess with you, the bacteria are going to express different genes, they're going to use different pathways, you may have different waste products, and over time you're going to have different populations and a different ecosystem structure and behavior. And when you start thinking about food in terms of how concentrated a growth medium does this make stuff when I drop it into the lumen of the gut, when you express it in terms of the sugar and starch content per 100 grams, you see that you get a much clearer delineation between the ancestral foods and the modern foods, which is certainly more clear than you ever get looking at caloric density or glycemic or insulinemic index. So you could argue that this is perhaps a better shot at explaining why these ancestral foods can be eaten, with universal impunity from a metabolic point of view. So what are the factors that are probably going to end up mattering in diet? I mean, it's easy enough when you look between a Twinkie and you look between a potato or some fruit. But when you look at the stuff in between and you're trying to think about, well, what's really going to make the difference here? Is it this carbohydrate density? Is it the fact it's got cells? Is it because it may have evolved antimicrobial factors like honey might have? the main point is probably going to be, does the food retain the characteristics that evolved to prevent it being degraded by microbes or to slow that down? And real foods are essentially, they're of life, and the answer to that question is yes. And processed foods and things with grain, flour, and sugar, the answer is no. They've been made more with a view to mouthfeel, shelf life, does it make a good dough, that sort of thing. They haven't been thought about in terms of what do they do to microbes. So what I'm suggesting might be going on in the upper gut is analogous to what's happening to a river with fertilizer runoff. You've got a sudden availability of some nutrient that some species within that ecosystem are going to seize hold of and run with. They're going to bloom, their numbers are going to go up. They're going to interfere with complex interactions that were going on in other parts of the ecosystem. They may crowd out other niches, and they might make waste products or do other things that generally create a toxic effect in the river. That's the smell of the thing and what it does to the fish. And what might be going on in the small bowel is the early inflammation that's affecting the vagus nerve, disrupting food intake. And of course, the overwhelming majority of your immune system, which is trying to happily sunbathe next to your guts and keep an eye on everything, if that decides that what's going on in your gut stinks, then the ramifications could be pretty bad, not just for producing that early inflammation for the vagus nerve, but systemically in other ways. So a bit of an overview, if you're a hunter-gatherer and you're eating living, cellular, evolved sources of carbohydrate, neither your mouth, your gut bacteria, your immune system, it's all seeing stuff that it's seen for hundreds of millions of years, and everything carries on as it's evolved to cope with. And I'm saying that it's possible you might be able to eat pretty high glycemic index foods, and we're actually evolved to cope with those in the absence of inflammation. A lean Westerner, when he first starts eating acellular and dense carbs, he's probably, my hunch is that you're making a large number of those microbial changes very early on. What might make the inter-individual differences is whether or not that host system responds to those changes in an inflammatory way if the immune system gets upset, so to speak. Of course, when it does, then you get the vagal and hypothalamic changes, the early inflammation that produces the decreased leptin and insulin signaling that in time can lead to obesity and diabetes. And of course, the overall systemic pro-anti-inflammatory imbalance could promote individuals to autoimmunity, which might explain how returning to an ancestral diet yields such good results against autoimmunity when people observe what's going on in their clinics and in their own cases. Cardiovascular disease, of course, is in there, in the mix potentially, and it's worth pointing out that we had a cardiovascular disease problem a long time before we had an obesity problem, so it may actually occur even earlier in these changes than obesity, so we should definitely be mindful of that when we're choosing how to eat. When we start eating an ancestral diet, once we've been obese, we can go into remission from obesity, but we're not magically turned into hunter-gatherers. We know that if we go back and start eating, eating small elements of Western diet, it hits us hard and we end up with weight gain, which is a real shame if you happen to like the occasional treat. If this whole hypothesis is correct, the memory element of that system may well be the gut-associated lymphoid tissue, its immune system, either through tissue memory or cellular memory. It's the element that means why we've got to carry on eating very carefully, because now the system's primed and looking out for the problem. During fasting, a lot of the effects of fasting might be because we're draining the swamp and essentially temporarily simulating a diet without those powdered carbohydrate elements that were producing the problem. Fasting, stool transplant even, or probiotics might be useful in breaking a locked-in ecosystem that's stubbornly hanging on if it proves that becomes an issue with some patients. Analogous to what goes on with C. difficile after antibiotics. Of course, that's much more severe. It's unlikely to help unless we also maintain changes in diet, unless we get lucky and find a super probiotic. Of course, there's good evidence for the bacteria being able to tell the difference between old and new foods in the terrible tooth decay that occurs as soon as we start eating Western diets. And an excellent study that was done a few years ago, led by Alan Cooper out of Australia, they sequenced the microbiota from inside a sort of a time capsule of dental tartar. showing that when farming was introduced, there was a big change in the microbiota, and we got periodontitis causing organisms arrived. And then later, after the Industrial Revolution, there was a great big decrease in diversity, and the mouth was dominated by tooth decay causing strains, which of course is, may also be what's leading to this association with cardiovascular disease, if the hypothesis is correct. So if it is right, it will be consistent with how ancestral diets are producing that macronutrient-independent freedom from Western diseases. It would also explain how low-carbohydrate diets were working, because you'd be cutting out carbohydrate the problem carbohydrates as part of reducing all carbohydrates. It would also explain how such very small changes towards Western diet can impact health, different processing of foods, how you store things, doing things for shelf life, or the arrivals of small amounts of flour and sugar. Of course, all those things look confusing if you're looking at them from just a macronutrient or a chemical composition point of view, but if we have to deal with microbial ecosystems, then all sorts of changes could have effects in that way. It might explain the distribution of thrifty genes, how Europeans are more resistant to overweight, given that we've had longer and more severe pre-exposure to grains. And during our long winters, we may be more dependent on what's coming out of our granaries than people who are doing some early farming, but in warmer regions where you'd still have more alternative sources of food, perhaps. And you wouldn't have to have a covert diabetes epidemic. It could simply be working by gradually reducing the fertility rates in the people who are susceptible to that. It would explain the dental health collapse that arrives when Western foods arrives, and the correlation of other diseases, of cardiovascular disease, with oral health. It might also explain how multivitamins, minerals, and fiber, when you add them on top of the Western diet, don't replicate the benefits of ancestral diet, and indeed why fruit and veg themselves aren't powerfully protective. It's more that they're safe ways of getting micronutrients and calories into the system without starting this bacterial party, rather than containing super-duper nutrients and being superfoods, which, there's not a lot of evidence to support them being powerfully protective in that way. Now, of course, when you look at the literature, you'll see lots of information about the microbiota. You'll see a lot of research about colon fiber and short-chain fatty acids. And these do have small but significant effects on the metabolism. The thing is, fiber's been really well tested, and we know that it mostly makes people just poop better. If the benefits of ancestral diet are coming from the microbiome, I don't see how it can be through short-chain fatty acids and the bowel, because otherwise, why doesn't fiber work better? I don't think we've got a problem with a lack of fiber. I don't think our microbiota is starving. I think some bits of it may be doing a little too well as a result of all the flour and sugar we've been throwing into our mouths. Of course, this hypothesis also points out that maybe all flours might be part of the problem, because you'd expect them to have similar effects to the wheat and more conventional flours, which might explain why going gluten-free will only really typically make you lose weight if you replace those gluten-y products with real fruit, veg, with real foods. Some people may get some improvement of inflammatory symptoms with the paleo flours because they're doing away with a lot of lectins, protease inhibitors, and other nasties. But in general, the replacement flours are pretty. You have to view them as a half measure. I wouldn't advise them, especially to someone who is sick and trying to recover. So perhaps a few interesting thoughts on evolution with why Europeans are coping better with the Western diet. If the hypothesis is correct, we're actually in an evolutionary race with bacteria, and we wouldn't necessarily expect to win that race because they've got such short life cycles compared to us. But our immune adaptation is fast enough. But we may not actually have the option to ignore what our gut microbes are up to, especially if what they're doing represents a real threat, in which case we could get infected and sick. So that may limit the amount of adaptation we can make to how much we respond to what's going on in the gut, which may explain why a lot of the European adaptations seem to be somewhat downstream with changes in levels of adiponectin and that sort of thing. It also raises the question about what if you eat a diet that's nearly right but not quite, you do tend to get weight regain over time. And is that a shift in the host response to what's going on in the gut? Or could it be the bacteria and microbes themselves are better exploiting low levels of Western food? Are they winning that evolutionary race or transferring genes to each other? And it all sort of argues against cheat days and being glib about these things. So we're looking for something that fits the puzzle, that explains what's going on, the difference between starchy ancestral foods and Western carbohydrates. We know that there's emerging evidence of the huge power of the microbiota, the immune role, that there's early inflammation going on to stop interfering with energy homeostasis, and it's all against this backdrop of evidence from the epidemiology and the evidence from dental epidemiology. And so the hypothesis that the gut bacteria are the sensor of this seems to fit. And also, if you plug it into, it seems to have a decent predictive value of what foods you can get away with eating with impunity and which ones you can't. It's just over time we'll find out whether or not the big picture emerges looking something like this, or whether it'll actually turn into something that just looks a bit like it, but it's actually different. So I want to thank Jamie Scott and the organizing committee for inviting me to talk, and especially for letting me talk via video. And thank you very much to my friend and colleague, Dr. Andrew Samis, for many years of debate over lunches. Thank you very much.